This is a bit of an experiment. It's an experiment within an experiment, I guess. So I've never done like a visual presentation before, so excuse my shitty drawing skills. I'm going to try to walk through this drawing, and I guess this is also within a meetup, within a conference, so we've got 2 levels of experimentation going on today. So my name is Neha. I'm on Twitter as OliPhantasm, if you want to connect. And I'm going to be talking about being problem solvers first, makers second. So what I mean by that is, most of us obviously encounter problems on a daily basis, and many of us are makers. So as a show of hands, do we have any engineers or DevOps, kind of SecOps people here? Yep, okay, cool. Around half, if not most. Anybody who's like a product manager or like a delivery lead or a non-engineer? Cool. So those of us who are non-engineers, we also make things, but the things that we make aren't necessarily code. So for this talk, what I want us to do is just have a bit of a think about a situation. Imagine that we are all makers. We're all, let's say, engineers in a delivery team. And what we make is, like, let's say a recruitment site. It's a website where people can search for jobs, apply for jobs, and hopefully get jobs as well. So our users are going to be job seekers, but we're also going to have people who are advertising jobs as our users. So they're the people with the problems that need to be solved. So in an ideal world, or a version of an ideal world, imagine we've got our users who go to our website. So it's someone who's looking for a job. So they search for their job and they encounter a problem. They're trying to apply for a job, but they find that actually there's so much information they need to enter around their job history, like their education history, every single job they've been on, et cetera, et cetera. That's obviously a real pain point, right? That's a legitimate problem that they're facing. In an ideal world, that person would be able to speak directly to us as makers, and they'd be able to say, hey, listen, it's a real pain that I have to provide so much information. Is there a way that you could maybe just add a CV upload so I can upload my CV, I don't have to enter all these details, and then the person advertising the job can see what my history is, and they can figure out whether I'm an appropriate fit. Makes it much easier for me. I save all this time. And then we as the makers, we'd go, okay, cool. So your problem is you're wasting a lot of time, and the solution that you think that we should follow is to create a system to upload your CV. Now, if we were a true maker, we would ask questions. We'd sort of have our research and our design hats on, and we'd say, well, why do you need to provide a CV? Do you even know whether the job recruiters look at your CV? Maybe they don't look at CVs anymore. Maybe what they do is they look at your LinkedIn profile to see how active you are. You know, maybe they look at other factors. So how do you know that that's actually going to get you the job that you want? So we'd be able to ask these questions and figure out whether the solution that we've been given is the right solution and whether we really understand the problem that's trying to be solved. And the great thing is, even if we got it wrong, the feedback loops are so tight, we could try something out, send it to the user, they could say, yeah, it doesn't really solve my problem, and we could keep kind of circling through those cycles. But they're really short, quick feedback cycles. That's a version of an ideal world. In reality, most of us don't actually work in that environment. We actually work in an environment more like this. The real world is way more complex, right? What actually happens is we've got our job seeker. They have a problem, they speak to someone from customer support, who then creates a Zendesk ticket, which then goes to someone from maybe analytics, who's doing some analysis on the different types of problems that people have with the site, which then goes to a product manager who says, okay, this is an aspect of the site that actually has a lot of problems for a lot of people, so let's prioritize this area. Which then goes to a BA who says, okay, so this is a solution that came through from the user, so let's write this into a story with all this acceptance criteria and some nice designs for our maker, which is us, to now build. So we've gone through so many different proxies. That problem has been reinterpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted so many times. By the time it comes to us, it's something completely different. And it's also a solution. So we, as makers, haven't had a chance to understand the problem and come up with more creative solutions. So something that could have maybe solved the person's problem is just creating a field where the job seeker could have just added the link to their LinkedIn profile, and boom. You just paste the link, so that way the recruiter, they could click on the link, see your LinkedIn profile, get the information they need. No one needs to copy anything, upload any documents, anything like that. But again, we weren't part of that process of exploring the problem. We were just handed a solution that went through a number of different people. So not only does it take a long time for that to come to us, but by the time it comes to us, it's been reinterpreted and it might not necessarily solve the problem. So we get a solution, not a problem, which is not great. The problem doesn't happen in front of us, so we can't even validate whether we've really understood the problem. And to Juan's point earlier on, there's actually a lot more to the problem. There's not necessarily one root cause. There could be multiple root causes that we don't really understand. And obviously, we can't do everything, right? We're makers. Just because we're makers, it doesn't necessarily mean we're good at asking unbiased questions to get to the root causes. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're good at designing UI to make sure that actually it becomes very intuitive for the job seeker to be able to enter in their details. So this is the real world that we tend to live in. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what it is that we can do, given this is the situation that most of us are in, and there's always things that we can do. So the writing might get a little bit small here. I don't know if you can still read this in the back. So around the point of not necessarily having the right skills in the team. These days, most teams tend to have a product manager or a product owner or a BA, but most teams still seem to be missing researchers, UXers, and designers. So these are core skills that we need that actually really help us do root cause analyses and understand our problem domains a lot better. So even if we don't have these people in our teams, there are things that we can do in order to try to practice some of the skills that these folks tend to master. So there's things like asking unbiased questions, and trying to understand what's the difference between an assumption, an opinion, and a fact. So oftentimes, like a user might tell us, look, it takes me ages to fill in this form. That's an opinion. That's not a fact. Because what is a long time for you might be a short time for me. So that's not specific. It doesn't tell us anything about whether it's taking them 2 minutes, 5 minutes, whether it's easy, and how easy is it? Do they need to click 5 times? Do they need to click 2 times? So that's an opinion. And what we need to do as makers, as good makers, is understand what's the assumption that's being made? Can we validate that assumption? What's the opinion? Can we make that more specific so it turns into a fact? And once we have those facts, that's when we actually have things that we can work with to actually design the right solutions and make the right things. So there's 2 main tools that I would recommend here. One is using SMART. Has anybody come across SMART before? Yep. Old, like this is one of those things from the old Prince 2 BA kind of academy world from the 1970s and 80s, which is actually beautiful. It's really simple. It's an acronym that stands for various different things, like there's different versions, but one of them is SMART, one of them is specific, measurable, accurate, relevant, and time-based. So the idea is anytime someone tells you something, see if you can smartify it or make it smarter. So instead of saying we've got product, and let's say we've got marketing, sales, and finance. So imagine these are all 3 different cogs that turn together to create value for the business. Generally what happens is each of these functions tends to work at a different pace. So when we look at technology, tech teams are able to sort of build and deploy code pretty quickly more often than not. So, you know, we've got amazing CI/CD tools, practices, culture in a lot of organizations. So you could theoretically, in many organizations, build and deploy code maybe on an hourly, daily, weekly basis, which is pretty amazing. However, what happens is we build that code, and in a lot of organizations, we then aren't ready to release for at least a couple of weeks or sometimes months, sometimes up to 6 months. So we can only have 6 monthly cycles. And that's because the rest of the business actually works at a completely different pace. So what we've actually done is we've created this situation where we're creating value in one small part of the business, but we haven't looked at the overall big picture. So we aren't actually optimizing for the whole. We've not seen the full picture. We've optimized for one small part of the business. And as you know, as a developer, as someone working in a delivery team, that is one of the most frustrating things. And it also means that we increase our business risk. We increase our technical risk because there's all this code that isn't necessarily being used, but we have to maintain, we have to monitor. And we don't even know if it's going to solve the right problem. So by the time we actually launch, the problem may have shifted or the context may have shifted. So that's a very risky way of working. So one way in which we can try to combat that is we either try to optimize for each of those individual silos to make sure that other parts of the business work at similar rates of pace, or we can try to work as one team. So create like these mini businesses almost, where in your team, you have a member of finance or marketing or sales, whatever's required or whoever's required to be able to push the thing through and measure impact. They're part of your day-to-day team. Another thing we can do as a step of moving towards this direction is to map out the value stream. So who are all of those proxies that are involved in the process of understanding the user's problem, coming through to us, and then going back to the user, and then validating whether their problem was solved. By doing this sort of value stream mapping exercise, we actually understand where sometimes assumptions get made and where the problem or the solution can sometimes be reinterpreted. So having visibility of that is incredibly powerful. And it also means it gives you access to people who you can then bring into your team, into your one team, to engage as part of understanding the problem and prioritizing stuff. Okay, so we've spoken that there's lots of proxies, which obviously causes us a lot of problems. Now, part of this, part of like trying to deal with the fact that we have a lot of proxies is sometimes we can try to create stronger relationships with these proxies, and sometimes we can try to get rid of some of the proxies. More often than not, we're not going to be able to get rid of the proxies. People play a valid role in an organization, and it's important for us to understand the value that they're creating. So what we can do is we can try to see, is it easier to access these people? So in some cases, it might be you take the salesperson out for a coffee, and then maybe they'll be able to take you the next time they go to visit a customer to see the customer. You know, are there things that we can do to make it easier to access the users? So for example, it's hard to know where the users are, like where do you go to find your users? Sometimes they might even be people in your family. So for example, once when I was working on a recruitment website, I found out just by doing a Facebook post that actually I had a couple of friends who'd actually used our site and used similar sites. So I didn't have to do very much at all to find other people who I could actually observe potentially and get some feedback from. There's other things as well that we can do. So even if we can't get access to our end users, it's really powerful to be able to spend some time with customer support. Has anyone sort of done like customer support sessions, you know, as part of their onboarding or like ongoing? Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. In fact, Nuno here, he's organized these customer extreme sessions for our current team where they spend a couple of hours with customer support and with the different markets, and it's amazing what you learn just by hearing what the customers are saying on the phones. And in fact, it's not just what you hear. By working with customer support, you can also ask questions for customer support to ask the users that customer support might not even be aware of, because they might not know how the system actually works. So that can be a really powerful partnership. And the other thing, which we don't do enough of, is doing usability testing and doing site visits. So once you've actually built something, you've deployed it, how do we even know it works? Have we ever watched someone use the thing that we made without actually having the evidence? Again, it's an assumption that what we've done works, and it's an assumption that what we've done works well. So it's really important to validate those assumptions by actually watching people use what we build. And just as out of curiosity, how many people here do any usability testing on the stuff that they build? Yeah, it's actually one of the quickest wins, one of the easiest things to do. You could even get, especially when it comes to standard usability, you could actually get non-experts, so people who aren't, let's say, looking for a job, you could still get them to test your site. So like you could get your partner or your friend to just try to make their way around the website. Okay, so some other things. So we culturally, socially, personally tend to not think about problems first. We actually tend to think about solutions first. And some of the contributing factors are conditioning, our education, the incentives we have in society, and also some of the taboos that we have. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it's quite often, for example, for us to hear from senior managers, I want solutions, not problems, right? That's something that gets heard in all sorts of organizations. Another thing that we also hear is when someone comes up with an idea, or if you come up with an idea, right, and you share it with a colleague, when someone says, oh, that's a great idea, it feels good, right? We get like a little bit of a rush. It like hits our ego. So there's like this natural response that we have to coming up with good ideas. We are naturally inclined to be creative, and we like building things. We like coming up with ideas. But all this does is it reinforces that bias that we have. So it makes it sometimes harder to actually not focus on the idea, not focus on the solution, and focus on the problem instead. And there's this saying in English, or he's a real ideas man. I don't know if that's a saying in Portugal at all. It's like an incredibly positive thing. It means that, oh, this person comes up with lots of ideas, really creative. It's a really positive thing. I would argue if you were to switch that and say, he's a real problems man, that wouldn't exactly be seen in the same positive light. So I think the word problem probably has a little bit of a PR exercise to do. You know, we think the problems are bad, but actually they're incredibly powerful and they're really important to understand. And like a personal example that we have going on at the moment is around Brexit. So in the media, we're hearing a lot about politicians who initially said, yes, we should Brexit. Then they're saying, no, we shouldn't Brexit. Then they're saying, yes, we should Brexit. And then, no, we shouldn't Brexit. And having worked in government, I know it's, first of all, politics is politics, right? But having worked in government, there's actually a natural there's incentives that stop politicians from actually changing their position based on evidence. So there are a number of examples where we've run experiments in government labs and we've said, look, this was your policy idea, here's the evidence, and here's what we've run with other variations of the policy, and here are the actual outcomes. What do you think we should do? And the answer is pretty clear. But the politicians know that if they change their mind, they are going to be lambasted in the press. Everyone's going to say, oh, they're flip-flopping, they have no idea what they want to do, there's no clear sense of direction. And even when senior leaders change their mind, we go, oh, poor leadership, really weak. So there's something also about how we set up the incentives and the taboos that actually make it very difficult for people to be focused on problems and change their position based on what they learn. So tying in with that is this concept that we're not really all that comfortable with failure. Again, there's a lot of bad messaging we get around failure. Even the word failure, it's very negative. And what I would do is I would suggest that we rebrand failure just like we rebrand problems. Oh my God, I love this song. Is it Star Wars? No, Jurassic Park. Sorry. Okay, coming back to this. I would suggest that what we do is we rebrand failure. And what we do is we say there's two types of failure. There's good failure and there's bad failure. So good failure is when you make a mistake once, but you learn from it. And then you make sure that that double loop learning happens and you don't make the same mistake again. Bad failure, however, happens again and again and again. So there's no systemic learning. And it's very costly. So if we recognize the difference between good and bad failure, we can actually treat it in a different way as well. We can celebrate when we've had good failure. If someone in the team makes a mistake or we experience failure and we share that openly and we share how we avoided it the next time, that's giving an incentive. That's actually showing that it's okay to talk about failure. And in fact, we embrace good failure. However, again, we don't really do that quite so much. Then the other thing is around learning and how we kind of treat problems. So again, Joan spoke a little bit about like sort of doing analysis and trying to understand the causes for things. There are some really cool tools like the 5 whys, which have been used for root cause analysis. And I think we saw that causal, I can't remember the term that you used. It was like a causal tree or it was like a series of number of sort of root causes basically, not just a single thing. It's like a causal net, sorry. Of contributing factors that result in the problem. So we get a much better idea of that when we use tools like the 5 why or fishbone diagrams. We can also do things like applying the concepts of TDD to the problem. So test-driven development is all about you write your test first, it fails. You write your code and you keep writing and testing until your test passes. We could do the same thing with problems. So we could actually write what success looks like, write our acceptance criteria, not from an implementation perspective, from behavioral perspective, and then write the code, or then come up with the idea of the solution and see if that actually validates against the success criteria. Now, another way to do that would be to practice something called BDD, behavioral driven development, but you can apply this concept at various levels of the problem. And it's incredibly powerful because in actual fact, you're getting the person who can confirm whether or not something is a success to actually validate what you've done before you've even written a single line of code. Then the other thing is to kind of apply more of a hypothesis based kind of a hypothesis-driven approach to development. So there's things like you can take on bets or experiments. I'm not going to go too much into this because there's amazing stuff on the internet around this, but there's a gentleman called John Cutler on Twitter, and ThoughtWorks as well have posted a lot of stuff around hypothesis-based development. I would highly recommend following them, reading up on some of these articles if you haven't already, and trying some of these out in your teams. Now, one of the other factors around why we're not comfortable with failure and learning is that there's always a bit of discomfort around having an idea and then someone either saying that was actually kind of shit, or watching someone use what you just built and seeing that they're really struggling with it. It affects our ego, it really does, and it's important for us to recognize that. There's nothing wrong with feeling uncomfortable around failure. It's actually really important to recognize that, because if you don't recognize that, we're not going to be able to move past it. So sometimes in retrospectives or after usability tests, sometimes in teams, what we do is we actually talk about how uncomfortable we felt with what we just learned. And then once we accept that, we can actually move on and focus on the next thing. And then the last thing, which we kind of touched on upon a little bit earlier, was that we actually like learning and we like being creative and making things. There's actually a whole bunch of hormones we tend to release when we're in flow. There's endorphins, there's dopamine, and there's various other ones I can't even pronounce. And it results in a sense of well-being. It increases our creativity. So we have to embrace the fact that being a maker is actually good for us. It's almost like we're biologically wired to be makers, to be productive. But again, it doesn't mean that we have to be a maker at the expense of being a problem solver. We can understand the problem and then focus on the making. So, in summary, there's a whole bunch of tools and techniques that we can use in the real world in order to deal with the complexity of the situations that we all work and live in. And hopefully you'll be able to use some of these if you haven't used them before. And hopefully they'll help you become stronger problem solvers and even stronger makers as well. That's it. Thank you.